Robert Porter didn't realize his land was poisoned until the rabbits stopped coming. It was spring of 1992, and he'd been farming the same 47 acres in southern Ohio for nearly 3 decades. But something had changed. The eastern section, the part closest to his neighbor's property line, had become quiet. Dead quiet. No birds. No insects humming in the grass. Just the sound of wind moving across ground that felt wrong. He walked the fence line one morning and found it. An old gate he'd never noticed before, rusted almost closed. Beyond it, the woods were full of garbage. Old car parts. Barrels. Metal drums stacked in the creek bed. For years, his neighbor had been using this land as a dumping ground. Robert stood there, understanding immediately that his farm had been poisoned slowly, silently, while he worked the other side of his property. The soil was contaminated. The creek was contaminated. And he had no money to fix it. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching this story from down in the comments. And if this story already feels interesting and worth your time, consider subscribing to the channel. Now, let's get back to the story. Robert Porter had grown up poor in a farming family that believed in hard work and not complaining. His father had farmed this same land in the 1960s and 1970s, teaching Robert that the earth was not just a business, it was a responsibility. You took care of it and it took care of you. That was the deal. But Robert's father had also believed in traditional farming. He used chemicals. He pushed the soil hard. When Robert took over the farm at 24, he quickly realized something his father's generation had missed. Farming the old way was destroying the land. So Robert changed everything. He stopped using chemicals. He started rotating crops differently. He studied soil like it was a language he needed to learn. He read books borrowed from the county library. He talked to other farmers who believed in organic methods. Slowly, his farm got better. The soil got darker. The crops got stronger. By 1992, Robert had built something good. Something worth protecting. Now that poisoned section felt like a death sentence. The bank wasn't interested in helping. The county wasn't interested. Nobody had money or time for contaminated land in rural Ohio. Robert had 2 choices. Walk away from 20 acres and lose 1/3 of his property value, or figure out something himself. Most farmers would have given up. Robert started thinking like a puzzle solver. Robert spent 3 months in the county library studying everything he could find about contaminated soil. He learned about something called phytoremediation, a word nobody around him knew. It meant using plants to clean poison out of earth. Certain plants, willows, poplars, sunflowers, hemp, could actually absorb heavy metals and toxins from soil. The plants would pull the poison up through their roots, store it in their leaves and stems, and then you'd harvest the plants and remove them. The soil got cleaner year after year. It sounded impossible. It sounded like trying to fix a broken thing by breaking it more. But Robert understood something his neighbors didn't. Nature was always trying to heal itself. Humans just got in the way. If you stopped fighting nature and started working with it, amazing things happened. He made a decision that would seem crazy to everyone he knew. He would plant directly into the contaminated soil. Not food crops, not yet, but fast-growing plants that absorbed toxins. Willows along the creek. Sunflowers in the middle sections. Plants that could clean the earth while he waited and watched. "You're planting in poison," Eddie Morrison, his neighbor to the south, said when Robert told him the plan. "That's insane, Robert. You're wasting seed and time." Robert didn't argue. He just started digging in spring of 1993. If you're listening from farm country tonight, and you've ever had to fix something broken that wasn't your fault, I'm curious where you're watching from. Tell me where you're listening in the comments. Year 1 looked like failure. The willow saplings grew, but slowly. The sunflowers came up, but not as tall as normal sunflowers. Neighbors drove past and shook their heads. The bank still wanted its payments. Robert's wife, Margaret, worried quietly about money they didn't have. But Robert kept watching. He started keeping detailed notes on soil samples. He dug holes in different spots, looking at color and texture. By the end of year 1, he noticed something small. The soil in the planted areas was slightly darker. Just slightly. But it was changing. Year 2, the willows got thicker. The sunflowers grew taller. Robert brought in a soil tester from Ohio State University, a young man who worked with organic farmers. The test results showed something remarkable. The toxin levels were dropping. Not fast, but dropping. "It's working," the university man said, surprised. "I've read about phytoremediation in theory, but I've never seen someone actually do it." "You're actually doing it." Word started spreading through the farming community. Slowly, carefully, not as Robert's crazy idea, but as Robert's experiment with plants. By year 3, even the skeptics noticed. The eastern section looked different. The grass was greener. Small animals were coming back. Eddie Morrison pulled up to the fence one day and just watched for a while, not saying anything. "How much longer?" Margaret asked in year 4. "I don't know," Robert said honestly. "But it's working. I can feel it working." The spring flood of 1997 came fast and hard. Rain fell for 6 days straight. The creek that ran through Robert's property swelled brown and angry. Water moved across the fields. Everyone in the county was worried about erosion, about topsoil washing away, about disaster. Robert's cleaned section, the one with the willows and the years of restoration work, was right in the path of the worst water flow. He stood at his fence line watching the flood move across his land and understood that everything he'd worked for in 5 years could disappear in a single night. His neighbors gathered at the feed store after the rain stopped. They were talking about who'd lost soil, who'd lost crops, whose fields were ruined. "What about Porter S. Place?" somebody asked. Nobody had a good answer. They all expected the worst. The next morning, Robert walked his eastern section for the first time after the flood. The willow roots had held. The soil didn't wash away. The replanted topsoil stayed in place. The plants he'd grown for 5 years had saved the land. During the worst water, those roots had gripped the earth and refused to let it go. But more than that, the soil underneath was different now. It was actually good soil. Dark, rich, clean. The flood had proven something. The restoration was real. Word spread differently after the flood. Eddie Morrison came by and asked Robert to show him the phytoremediation process. Other farmers started asking questions. The county extension office called and asked if Robert would speak at a meeting. Robert Porter, the crazy farmer, became Robert Porter, the man who figured something out. By 1998, his eastern section was clean enough to plant actual food crops again. The first real harvest from that poisoned land came that fall. The yield was good. The quality was excellent. And there was no poison in the soil anymore, just earth that had learned to heal itself. Some neighbors still didn't understand, but most did. Robert's land became known as the best managed farm in the region. Not because it had never been damaged, but because he'd refused to accept that damage was permanent. Robert Porter never wrote a book about what he learned. He never became famous. But farmers came from other counties to see what he'd done, and he showed them everything. The land doesn't forget what's been done to it. Contamination leaves marks that take years to heal. But land also has a kind of memory, a memory of how to be healthy. And if you're patient enough to let it remember, if you work with nature instead of against it, healing happens. Most people in 1992 thought Robert was making a mistake when he decided to plant in poison. Maybe you would have thought the same thing. I'm curious what you would have done in that situation. Robert taught us something important. Sometimes the broken things are just waiting for someone brave enough to fix them slowly. Not fast. Not with expensive solutions. But with patience and understanding of how life actually works. If stories about land, healing, and quiet determination mean something to you, stay with us for the next one. Years later, Robert would stand in that eastern section, surrounded by healthy crops, dark soil, and the sound of birds, and remember the day he found the garbage. The poison had been real. The problem had been real. But so was the solution. It was just waiting in the earth all along.